Welcome to another episode of AI Pulse by ABBYY. Today, I am thrilled to have Ryan Carrier, the visionary behind ForHumanity, an organization dedicated to examining and managing the risks associated with AI systems. In this conversation, Ryan shares the origin story of ForHumanity. We dive deep into ethical and compliance challenges in the AI space, and in sharing his story, Ryan explains how independent audits can help create an infrastructure of trust in AI. Let's dive in. First of all, Ryan, thank you so much for joining the AI Pulse by ABBYY podcast. It's great to have you here. I think it's going to be a nice continuation of the previous episode that we had, and also the conversations and the panel and everything else that we had on the AI Summit from ABBYY in London. So I'm very curious to get now your angle on all of those different topics. But before we get started, I definitely wanted to learn a bit more about ForHumanity, which I think is absolutely a great initiative that you're running. And I think there's a lot of people not really familiar yet with the organization itself. So could you tell us a bit more about the organization's mission, the key goals you're striving to achieve when it comes to ethics and compliance? And really, actually, what I want to know is, what's the origin story? How did ForHumanity came to be?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for having me on. I appreciate it very much. So the origin story is actually kind of the right place to start. I had a 25-year finance career leading up to 2016. I had worked at Wall Street banks and ran my own hedge fund and worked for the World Bank and Standard & Poor's. But I was running a hedge fund. It was my 8th year of the hedge fund, and it was something that I survived but didn't thrive at. And the reason I share that part of the story is when you survive a hedge fund, it means you have to close it. And so now it's 2016, I'm preparing to close my hedge fund, which means I still have duties, but I have time on my hands. And we had built artificial intelligence to help us manage money. So I had good familiarity with AI. So I have time on my hands. I'm familiar with AI. But really, Max, the most important part of my story, my personal story, is I have 2 boys. And in 2016, they were 4 and 6 years old. And with this time on my hands, examining the world of AI, examining the growth in technology, the lack of governance, oversight, and accountability, and kind of projecting that out into their future, I don't mind sharing with you and the audience, I got scared. Scared enough that I started a nonprofit public charity with no money and no plan. It was just the mission statement. And the mission statement is this: to examine and analyze the downside risk associated with AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems. That's the scope of what we do, AI, algorithmic, autonomous systems. I will often call those AAA systems. But we accept those tools where they are. We're not in the business of, let's prohibit a bunch of things and so on. Now, we want robustness, right? We want a good approach. We want to mitigate the risk of these tools. So we examine and analyze the downside risk of these tools. There's lots of people out there to promote these tools. So we look at the downside risk, and then we aim to maximize the risk mitigations around these tools. Why? Because we feel like if we mitigate the risk to these tools, then we maximize the benefit of these tools for humanity. And that's where the overly ambitious name of the organization came from. In 2016, not having a plan, I explored through writing a lot of key issues, such as future of work, technological unemployment, rights and freedoms in the 4th Industrial Revolution, data. Should we own our own data? Is that part of the equation here? Even transhumanism, that's putting machines into our body. And how that's going to change how we relate to each other and even the nature of our species. But all of those challenges are kind of 20, 30, 40, like generational kind of challenges. And I'm a pretty practical person. I needed to do something now, something about that lack of governance, oversight, and accountability. And so it was June of 2017 when I first wrote about independent audit of AI systems. Now, people have been auditing technology, so I'm not trying to say that we invented or created that. But the idea of independent audit of AI systems takes the financial audit model that we've had a 50-plus year track record with and developed and advanced, and it's built an enormous, what I would call, infrastructure of trust. And so that infrastructure of trust is what we need to overcome this lack of governance, oversight, and accountability. And I do believe I was kind of the first person to write about these things. And we've focused at ForHumanity about developing this ecosystem and supporting this ecosystem of independent audit of AI systems. ForHumanity was just me all the way up until March of 2020. And now that we are drafting audits and we're in the business of supporting governments and regulators and individual voices through crowdsourced and transparent drafting of audit rules, we've now grown into an organization of more than 2,100 people from 98 countries around the world, drafting more than 50 certification schemes, working, as I mentioned, with governments and regulators on adoption of those schemes, working with global standards bodies to support the drafting of standards. And now this is kind of our primary and core work. Does that all make sense, Max?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think, well, first of all, it's a great story. And I think it's an important one. Like you said, having been in technology for a little while as well, always been fascinated by the art of the possible, but yet again, it's also one of the main conclusions that came out of, the discussions that I've been having a lot with people is that it's simply a fact of nobody's against the technology itself. I would even go to say that the compliance that we need, the ethics that need to be put in place, the boundaries that should be going up is more to make sure that there are no malicious actors that can use it in a way that is not intended to be. And I think, and we'll touch on this later on because I think it's definitely one of the topics that we'll discuss. But my main conclusion is it's not the technology, it's us that's usually the problem of how we use it, right?
Yeah.
So, no, I think what ForHumanity was doing is absolutely phenomenal. I'm great to see that it's growing as quickly as it is. Did you actually see an acceleration when all of the hype around large language models started, or did that wave for you already come earlier since you were very early into this entire topic specifically?
The wave for us came much earlier. As I mentioned, it was kind of me sort of screaming into the wind about ideas that I was sort of thinking and drafting and putting into place. And we had a couple of, I don't know if they're missteps. I'm kind of glad that they didn't come to be, but we were originally going to try to work with the big four accounting firms and establish the equivalent of the Financial Accounting Standards Board in AI, and got very high up in the process, very high up senior leadership at multiple of the big four organizations. But in the end, that didn't work out. I'm kind of glad it didn't, because now we're more of a grassroots organization. But that, that was one misstep. And then actually, New York City was going to build a center for responsible AI. They had $7 million allocated for that. And ForHumanity applied to be a part of that. And we were going to be a part of that rollout. That was supposed to roll out in March of 2020. And you might remember a little thing called COVID that hit at the exact same time.
I try not to. I don't know about you, but I try not to.
and they shut the whole thing down and never restarted it. And so that was kind of another misstep. We were kind of counting on that for funding and getting us going. And also, if you remember, it was actually kind of COVID that kind of got us started in a good way. Because if you remember, now people had a lot of time on their hands, right? They weren't going into the office. There weren't as many meetings going on. So I had people who were like, Ryan, what you're doing is right. How can I help? And so I was able to put sort of 25 people in the room, and we decided to look at digital contact tracing for COVID. And we decided to draft audits for that. It was one of the few things that people were focused on at the time. And so we got 25 people in the room, and the original premise was these experts would help draft the rules. So I kind of said, okay, so what are the rules? Crickets, Max, crickets. Like in 2 hours, we had like 5 rules. We were going nowhere fast. I'll get back to you in 2030 when we finish. Like it just wasn't going to work. And Shay Brown and a couple of other close friends and sort of stalwarts in this industry of algorithmic audit came to me on the side, and they're like, Ryan, this isn't working. Like, dude, I know. Like, what do you want to do about it? And he's like, well, you write the rules. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. Like, who's Ryan Carrier to write the rules? And they said, and it was funny because 3 people said the same thing, but they claimed they didn't talk about it in the background, which is kind of amazing. And they said, look, you don't understand. You could draft rules and they could be perfect rules, the exact right rules, but it doesn't matter if other people don't endorse them, review them, examine them, find the holes, find the gaps. In other words, society, groups of people have to accept rules. The person or the people that draft those rules, they're not important in the equation other than, are they getting their work done? And these people were like, let's not waste our time. If you can help us get our work done faster, let's do it. I said, all right, I'll give it a shot. And 2 days later, I got the group back together and I gave them 258 audit rules for digital contact tracing. And Max, that's where the magic happened. Because now these people were able to go, aha, if I spend 2 or 5 or 10 hours going through these rules, I can find the holes, I can find the gaps, we can define the terms, we can mold the process. And now that has turned into more than 50 different certification schemes, some submitted to governments and regulators already, more than 7,000 risk controls, treatments, and mitigations for AI. And it's enormous infrastructure that is now ForHumanity supporting the ecosystem of independent audit of AI systems. It's kind of amazing.
It is really amazing. And I was actually quite surprised that when you got that many experts into a room, that the answer was crickets. But what you then said, it does really make sense that it's not the actual rules, but it's the acceptance of the rules. And it's not the gravitas of the one person writing it, but it's actually everybody working together to make them, well, I guess, palatable, acceptable for society to be like, okay, yeah, okay, that makes enough sense that we'll actually follow them. Because you can have as many rules as you want. If nobody follows them, nothing's going to happen, right? So, yep. Speaking of that, it actually brings us to one of the first topics that I wanted to touch on. So I already referred back to the AI summit that we had in London, which was absolutely stellar. And the previous episode on the podcast, we'll actually hear from Alexander Hanf, who was a privacy expert that joined our fireside chat. But other persons who joined the fireside chat was, I think, somebody you know well, Andrew Perry. He actually highlighted that there's this concept, or actually there's a prediction from specifically referred to Jeffrey Hinton's prediction about artificial general intelligence. Now, of course, artificial general intelligence, that's even, in my opinion, much beyond anything that we have today. I think we still have a very long way to go. Nonetheless, there are already ethical implications that it brings along, just the concept of it. And I think that's a good thing, that we're trying to be, at least that there's voices within the ecosystem, the community. They're trying to be prepared for when that moment actually comes, because I do think it's just a matter of time. Now, can you expand a little bit? You've already mentioned the frameworks. You've mentioned that you're working together with government bodies. But what considerations are absolutely vital when new companies, and we see a lot of startups in the space right now, doing AI development, and how are you actually encouraging them to follow a set of guidelines, follow a set of rules? And in doing so, have you actually discovered some ethical dilemmas in your line of work that you've had to deal with? Because you mentioned earlier, you were already very intimate with artificial intelligence in your previous endeavors. Are you using AI yourself today to actually help achieve the goals that ForHumanity has?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when we talk about governing AI and algorithmic systems, we think in the context of risk. So we think in the context of 5 areas or categories: ethical, bias, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity. Now, trust is a catch-all category. There we put things like explainability, disclosure, transparency, control, but the idea of, what makes these tools trustworthy. So given those 5 areas, the first and most important thing is for people, and here's the thing, the groups who are already leading the way, multi-billion-dollar organizations, do not have sufficient risk management in place. They do not have the capability to deal with these 5 areas of risk. And so the first thing that we advise is you need to be aware of these different kind of risks and harms. And you also need to ensure that you have robust infrastructure in place to deal with these questions objectively, independently, thoughtfully, for example, especially on these questions of ethical risk. So we're a long way from having the infrastructure in place to do all of this. In addition, there is still no governance, oversight, and accountability for any of these tools. So taking AGI and this wild west of technology should scare a lot of people. Why? Because you're talking about machines potentially smarter than us. And if you give them the ability to execute with resources, well, now you're at the beck and call of what that machine may or may not do. Now, I'll tell you, Max, I think we're a significantly long way away from general intelligence. We are very good at establishing narrow AI. We're very good at replicating all human tasks with machines. So if you think of replicating human tasks as a combination of how we think in our brain and even our heart and how we feel, right? But combined with human dexterity, eyes, nose, mouth, ears, how I move my hands, how I move around. We've built some amazing tools for autonomy. You've seen Boston Dynamics or autonomous driving vehicles. We have computer vision. We have, certainly audio recording and mimicking and so on. And then we have increasingly successful artificial intelligence at accomplishing a human task. Okay. So that's why it seems like we're making these huge advancements. But what humans do is we actually multitask. And I don't mean multitask like at the same time. What I mean is I can consider 5, 10, 12, 50 different things that I'm trying to maximize. And I can balance that with my thought process, with how I organize my time, with my creativity. Maybe I set time aside and go, what should I be doing new today? We don't have tools that are even remotely close to thinking about what should I create today, nor would they know how to. They'd have to be parameterized to do so. So those are things that are hallmarks of human intelligence, not the least of which is to act in a suboptimal way. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Humans are not just intelligence, and humans are not just dexterity. Humans are love, caring, thoughtfulness, empathy, forgiveness, hope. These are characteristics that are often suboptimal. Let me give you an example. You and I are good friends. We live in the same town, and I know that you're going through a struggle. Well, it's not optimal for me, the machine. Think of me as a machine, right? It's not optimal for me to stop what I'm doing, my optimized goal, and go, maybe I need to spend some time with Max. Maybe I need to just listen. Now, I could be a tool designed to listen to you in your troubles, right? And I am that, as well as being a father and a referee and a business owner and a friend and a churchgoer, all the things that make up who I am. I can't do those other things if I'm going to spend the time listening with you, talking through your issues, supporting you. And that's an act of what I would call sub-optimization. It's the ability to take one goal, raise it up, but recognize that we're doing that at the sacrifice of many other goals. And that is the very humanity that we exist in. And we don't have any tools remotely close to being able to make those kind of choices, especially based on love, caring, forgiveness, tenderness, empathy, and so on. Does that make sense, Max?
That's a great analogy to kind of really hit the nail on the head when it comes to why we're still so far away. And actually, I wanted to ask you the question, what you think on that. So in your example, in my view, let me give you my view real quick. I compare to what you just explained, me going on my twice daily walks, actually, where I'm not thinking about anything proactively. But it's usually also the time that actually the best ideas come to mind. And I think that in your story that you just told, the same thing can happen because you're doing actually a suboptimal task. It would be much more optimal for me to be going and doing work and being able to achieve goals 24 hours a day. But doing these suboptimal things allows us to go into, I would say, another component of our capabilities as humans and actually achieve more in doing so. And like you said, no machine, no system, no platform, no whatever is actually designed to do that. I think it's actually not something that can be designed, at least not in my mind, that I think we can come up with something in the next foreseeable future to do so.
Well, and what I would say is, and by the way, it's the shower for me. Maybe I'm giving away too much information here, but the shower is where all
No,
my best ideas
it's a very good place.
come from, because
It's a very
you're
good
just
place.
relaxed and you're just kind of, doing some
Yeah.
things, and your mind is pretty free in that time. So a similar kind of approach. Um, the issue is that, and some would argue, well, wait, setting aside time to think creatively, that is optimizing. And the answer is yes, collectively across many different tasks, allowing yourself some time to think creatively and find new solutions and solve problems, and like that is a form of optimization. But the reason I use the word suboptimal, and I think you did as well, is it is suboptimal compared to a specific task, right? So we have
Mhm.
this collection of tasks that we have to do, and the allocation of our resources across literally hundreds, thousands of human processes, when we're still not even great at doing single tasks. I mean, let's be clear. We've got great tools, okay? And they've advanced work in a lot of places, but they still have a lot of mistakes. When
Mhm.
ChatGPT came out, they didn't disclose hallucinations and a lack of that you should check all your sources, that it makes up sources and things like that. And so people were using the tool and they were getting a whole bunch of stuff wrong, and in some cases seriously wrong. Um, Having a tool that didn't make those mistakes, now that's optimization, right? Knowing that I don't have to go check the work, knowing that I don't have to go make sure that the sources are right. So let's get all of our tools better, and that's great progress. And then let's start to figure out how we do that collectively. And oh, by the way, as soon as you include human emotions, um, right? In terms of trying to model that and try to build that into a machine, because there's certain aspects we can replicate what looks like love or what feels like love, right? I can create a machine that brings you over flowers. I could create a machine that, cooks dinner for you. Okay. I can create tools that will look like love. But what looks like love to you doesn't look like love to the next person. And therefore, how do we figure out what those tools should look like? And in the end, there's some innate humanness to us. When you know that I set aside my time to come hang out with you because you're, kind of in a bad state, you need to be loved, the very choice in that brings love itself. You go,
Mhm.
wow, Ryan set aside it. He didn't have to do that.
There's the subliminal message
Mm,
that is not written. It is not transferred. You could almost compare, like, there's no data transfer that says, hey, acknowledge that I'm sending you this particular package of love
right.
and let me know that you've received it. That doesn't happen, but it is known.
That's correct. And it's a lot deeper than that. And by the way, I do not think that Silicon Valley and any technology I've come across is even in the vicinity of replicating or thinking about this true human connection.
Yeah. And on the topic, I actually wonder myself personally if there's even a need to actually move in that
Totally
direction.
agree.
Um, but you actually touched on something else that was quite interesting when you were talking through the fact that, when ChatGPT first came out, it made mistakes. There were no disclaimers of hallucinations. Um, it does bring to light, it has already brought to light, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these instances as well, the privacy concerns around artificial intelligence. I'll tell you an anecdote from our panel that we had, our fireside chat. So on the panel, we had Alexander Han. I met him at an airport. It was all kind of coincidence, another very human thing to happen, just connecting with people out of the blue. And he was discussing the fact that, ChatGPT actually declared him dead when he asked a question about who is Alexander? Who am I, according to the knowledge that you have? Now, of course, he's a privacy expert. He knows what he's doing. But the thing is that these systems are increasingly being looked at to actually provide decision-making assistance, in some cases, even actual decision-making. You talked about the fact that now these tools might go into the era that they have an impact on our resources, on decision-making. There's a lot of technological movement towards AI agents that actually do things for you. No longer they give you just textual feedback or they give you fancy cat images, but they will actually execute tasks for you. And I think there, the note that he made was, well, if I'm asking for a loan, if I'm asking for an insurance, if I'm just trying to open an account and somebody uses this information, which is entirely wrong, based on the input or actually the decision-making process, leveraging this kind of technology, it would have massive implications for me personally, for that person personally, and just social implications. I think that is definitely one of the main topics for humanity, to make sure that those things do actually not happen by, again, encouraging and even enforcing the frameworks that you guys have built.
So we've actually had these discussions recently with national data supervisory authorities. So we have a GDPR certification scheme for AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems. That's the scope. It's the first of its kind in the world, and it is in front of the European Data Protection Board and being reviewed currently. They have the mechanism, Article 42.2, well, it's really Article 42, to actually approve that scheme. And when they approve that scheme, then all groups seeking to certify GDPR compliance can use this certification scheme with an independent third-party auditor to create the highest level of assurance that they've complied with the law. In these discussions, these national data supervisory authorities said, we don't think any AI in the world is GDPR compliant. Think about what that means. It means it wasn't trained with a proper legal basis. In other words, the training data that you put in, where you scraped it from all over the place or wherever you got it from, if it's personal data, doesn't have proper legal basis or lawfulness to be used for that training purpose. It wasn't disclosed as such. So problem number one. Problem number two, as I think Alexander encountered, what do you do with an AI? What do you do with ChatGPT, a large language model, when it gets the personal data wrong? So let's say I say, who is Ryan Carrier? And it says Ryan Carrier is a 22-year-old young man from, Iowa. Okay. That's wrong. I'm an older man, middle age, maybe gray in the beard, right? That's wrong. And I'm not from Iowa and have never lived in Iowa. If I've barely driven through it. Okay. So under GDPR, I have the right to rectify that data. Our AIs don't have the ability to do that. So when you talk about tokenization in a large language model, I've recently created this term, token blocker. Can you go in and block certain tokens that are in error? And the answer is no, not really yet, but the law requires it, because you cannot have personal data about me in your artificial intelligence and have it be wrong, assuming I uncover it and assuming that I aim to change it, because I have rights to do those things. So you have to tell me what you have, then I can change it. And then what are you going to do about it? Now, not all AIs should be able to rectify, as an example. So there's different AIs where you might train a model to determine credit worthiness. And my input to that credit worthiness process might be one of 300 million records that you trained. So if my data is wrong in that model, and it's a stochastic model, so that coming out the other side, everybody puts in their parameters and then they're just they're tested against these parameters to see if you're
Yeah.
creditworthy, right? If my data is wrong as 1 out of 300 million data points, it kind of doesn't matter. Okay. As long as I have the right when I apply for that loan to make sure my data is correct, right? So it really depends on the nature of the model and the process, but we have to build our tools and our systems so that we're not breaking the law. And by the way, a lot of our artificial intelligence are. So it's a huge challenge in terms of privacy and personal data protection. We're a long way from solving these problems.
Yeah. And I think as, this technology always goes through several steps. I think I've been lucky enough to witness a few of these moments when there's new technology and it starts to become more and more, entrenched into our daily lives, but that also then seeps into businesses. It's always the personal space first. Although right now, I think with Apple and Apple Intelligence, and there's still a battle going on who's going to win the personal intelligence side. But nonetheless, it is because of the fact that people have been able to touch it, they've been able to play around with it very easily, that now this technology is almost becoming expected by the consumers in the business space. And, as they've uncovered the last couple, I would almost say the last 12 to 18 months, what it can actually do, what kind of purposefulness they can actually get from it, they've discovered that there's so much to take into account. And that's why I think, that's also why, for ABBYY, it's important to work together with ForHumanity, simply because we've always seen this kind of level of, insurance that you have to be able to provide, make sure that you're doing all the right things, because we are maybe not specifically in a singular tool or a single part of the solution, but overall it can have a ripple effect. I mean, we have customers, for example, where we do the processing of customs documents. Processing custom document wrong, maybe it will take a bit of time. We'll go into an exception flow. Somebody will have to look at it. There's catch-alls for any kind of thing that might happen. What you might not consider is that the effect that might have getting it wrong on the actual overall process, meaning that goods that might actually have a limited time frame or time span that you can use them don't get shipped properly or in time, which can then have an effect on somebody's livelihood because it's actually a business that's expecting them, or even a person is expecting that package to make something for their life happen specifically.
Or medicine.
For me, it's all those considerations.
Yeah.
So now that we're on that topic, I think it's a good time to actually talk a little bit about the fact that, these independent audits for AI systems, auditing is never an easy process. I think every company that has to perform audits has dedicated teams. They often start implementing it when they really have to, because it is time consuming. Although everybody considers it necessary, it's never something that I've ever seen anybody happy to do, to be absolutely honest with you, Ryan. And I think even though it's absolutely necessary, I agree with that 100%. It is yet another level of compliance and work that has to happen for businesses to actually be able to operate. And actually, typically, most businesses come from a way that they see, well, if I could do this, then I can actually offer more to my customers. And if I don't have to go through these compliance steps, I could do that faster. What's the typical kind of challenges that you've encountered in conducting these audits or actually helping people conduct these audits? And are there certain, I would always say, tips and tricks that you want to share with the audience from the podcast today to say, well, keep these things in mind. It will actually help you get there in the right way.
Sure. So there's a couple of things there. First off, most organizations are not ready for audits today of AI. So they're still building compliance capacity. They're still building the ability to meet the challenges of these audits. And I want to reflect on the history of financial audit as well. What was happening in 1973 was a race to the bottom. Auditors would go around, they'd say, look, if you follow my rules, I can lower your cost of goods sold. I can reduce your taxes. And the industry was fracturing where people were basically using their own rules. And so one of the key values of audit is comparability. Let's compare your audit to my audit to the next person to the next person's so that we can do comparables across industries, sectors, and so on. But if you're all using different rules, the comparability is gone. And so the industry saw this in 1973 and said, oh, this is a huge problem for us. Let's standardize. And so it was the Wheat Commission that turned into the Financial Accounting Standards Board, created generally accepted accounting principles. And companies saw the value of having these standards. It wasn't lawmakers. It wasn't regulators who mandated these audits. All these companies said, we're going to adopt these rules. And they began to adopt GAAP, or internationally, the International Financial Reporting Standards. So we had two sets of rules that are mostly similar, but they do have differences, and the differences cause some problems from time to time. So industry began to adopt these rules, but it didn't change exactly what you said, which was when the auditor showed up, everybody reacted the same way. It's like, it's going to be a bad doctor's visit, right, for the next 6 weeks, because the auditors are looking for this and that. And I got to grab it from all over the place. And, it was painful, right? And so it wasn't until 20 years in to mandatory annual audits with quarterly updates, okay, that the COSO system, so the Treadway Commission of Sponsoring Organizations, created COSO, C-O-S-O, and that established the internal audit and compliance by design process that said, yes, we know this is a cost center. Yes, we know you'd rather be out developing new ideas and new businesses and solving problems for people. But at the same time, we have to have robust governance, oversight, and accountability to know that we're doing these things correctly. So let's create compliance by design. And Max, that completely changed that fear of the auditor. Now, when auditors walk in, we meet them at the front door, politely walk them to the third floor conference room, lock them in that conference room for 6 weeks. We slide food under the door 3 times a day, and we pump compliance at them. Why? Because it's built compliance by design. And when you do that, you had some cost at the beginning, but now there's no cost to maintain that when it's compliance by design. And so that cost center issue goes away over time. Now, we're not there yet for AI. We have to build our compliance capacity and our compliance mechanisms, and that will be a cost. But it's an enormous benefit because it creates robust risk management. It creates robust processes to actually govern these tools and processes, to be accountable for failures or issues or challenges, and to provide proper oversight for those who could be held liable for failures. Okay. And so we want to establish that process by creating auditable rules. And when I say auditable, I usually use the term binary. What we're doing is we're taking laws, guidelines, best practices, and standards, most of which are not written to be auditable. Auditable in a binary fashion means one thing. If you are an independent third-party evaluator of compliance and you are at risk, can I look at your compliance and go, yes, Max complied, or no, Max did not comply with certainty? And there's aspects of the law where we don't want that kind of certainty. We write it that way. Standards where we want to leave it into the hands of the organization to determine how they do something. When we get to audit, we can't have that. That's not what auditors are paid for. And so we have to take these laws, guidelines, best practices, and standards and craft them artfully into these binary audit rules, because then we enable and empower third-party independent auditors to examine and go, yep, Max did it. I can prove it. I can document it here. No, Max, you didn't do it. Here's the things you missed. And you're like, oh, didn't realize, go back and fix it, get it right. And now you can be compliant. So that's the process that we're stepping through. And we're still building this ecosystem. But when we build this ecosystem, we can establish an enormous infrastructure of trust about things that are very opaque to the world, but they can be transparent and easily identified to an independent third-party auditor, balancing the value of intellectual property and trade secret against this need for disclosure, transparency, oversight. Does that make sense, Max?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And the thing that really, at least for me, it's a confirmation to hear it from you as well, is that it's a journey. We've seen it a couple of times over. my first real venture into all of the intricacies of auditing and compliance was when everybody started moving to the cloud. You had to provide a lot of answers to customers, and the list kept growing forever and ever. But all of it made sense. Like you said, now that it's built in, as we're designing our cloud systems by design to be compliant, it's become very easy. You almost click a button and you have the entire compliance capability reported. And there's not much that you actually have to do. So for me, it's really hopeful to hear that we are thinking ahead this time. Hopefully it won't be as painful, to actually be able to provide that for whoever it needs, whether that's government bodies or it's customers that have to provide it back to their customers. Because I do think there is that, again, that chain of events that's going to happen where we need to be able to prove, hey, as a business, I'm consuming artificial intelligence from different sources. And you'll have to be able to say, well, all of my suppliers, all of my vendors are actually in compliance. So I am in compliance. Plus, of course, the things that you do specifically. It's very similar to materials and making sure that even if something gets shipped from the other side of the world, it's still regulatory compliance in terms of foods, for example, that it's still the same quality as you would get without importing it.
Supply chain management.
So I think that makes, exactly. I think that makes absolute sense. But it does beg the question, right? So compliance is one thing. We can indeed build it in. Like you said, right now it's still a cost center. The ethics side of it, I think that's also something that is on a lot of people's minds. And for me, it feels like that is continuously growing, but there's also the very strong ambition to continue to innovate. What's your, I would say, almost like your gut feeling on how organizations can balance this, and maybe even more than gut feeling, maybe you even have a strategy of how they can build their AI innovations more ethically than they are today, I would say.
So AI is a socio-technical tool, which means that unlike a calculator, I plug in the numbers come out. For AI to function, the human needs, in most cases, needs to be a part of the process, whether it's in the training and the testing, but also the input to receive the output that impacts me. That's why we call it a socio-technical tool. As a result of that, there are ethical choices being made in design, development, deployment, monitoring, and even decommissioning. So all throughout the algorithmic lifecycle, there are these instances of ethical choice. And by the way, there's very few people trained on how to make those choices. There's very few organizations that recognize how to even do that. ForHumanity requires a standing and empowered ethics committee to be guided by the organization's code of ethics and the code of data ethics, to be in a position to adjudicate these instances of ethical choice with trained professionals, people who are trained on how to adjudicate instances of ethical choice. Let me give you an example. Axon Technologies is a drone surveillance company. They were building these surveillance tools to watch high schools for malicious actors. And so when the shooting in Texas at Uvalde happened, the CEO was talking to, law enforcement and other schools. And he came up with this idea of, well, maybe we should put a taser on our drone. Like, it's great if our drone can see that there's a problem, but if that person's racing in a building, like, we didn't really stop it. We saw it, but we didn't see the problem. We didn't do anything about it. And through heart, this CEO is like, well, maybe we should have been able to tase that person. We would have saved a bunch of kids and teachers, right? So he's thinking about changing his company from a surveillance company to a defensive weaponry company. Now, he had an ethics committee. That ethics committee said, nope, we're out. We don't do defensive weaponry. This is a stupid idea. It's the exact wrong answer. This is not what an ethics committee needs to do. What an ethics committee needs to do is say, hold on, interesting thought. Our organization and our stakeholders, including our customers and those schools and others, shareholders, right? A lot of stakeholders out there. They signed up for a surveillance company, right? They signed up for this surveillance technology. If we change to defensive weaponry, what does that mean to our shared moral framework? Now, if the ethics committee were doing its job the right way, they would be the advisor. They would be the therapist that would help walk the company through Here's our existing code of ethics. Here's what we're thinking about changing to. What are the pros and cons? What are the tensions and trade-offs of this choice? This is ethics in action. This is what we require standing and empowered ethics committees to do, to use your own code of ethics to be able to adjudicate these decisions, talk through on behalf of the organization how the shared moral framework should be executed or maybe potentially changed. And then what are we going to do about it? And so that is an example of a wonderful ethical dilemma. Should we be a surveillance company? Should we be defensive weaponry? And making that change, what are the costs and consequences of that? And that's why we need experts in the room who know what that shared moral framework is, know how to evaluate a change in a shared moral framework. Look, every organization, we've granted personhood to all our organizations. You can be a company and just go, look, we're going to maximize shareholder value, and that's legal. Now, a lot of organizations today, their customers won't accept that. They want to see that they're green, they're sustainable, that they're not just about ripping face off of people with maximizing profits. They're providing a good service and balancing, making money versus cost effectiveness and so on. So having a transparency about what that shared moral framework looks like is important to customers and stakeholders and users of these tools. And so we allow every organization under the law to establish their own shared moral framework. We just want it to be transparent so that customers can go, I don't want to work with your company because all you do is maximize your profits. I'm going to work with this LLM provider because they actually are trying to minimize the cost of their production of outputs from their LLM. And you're just, I'm doing more and more servers and more servers, and I just want to be faster and better for you, right? So it allows people to balance and make good consumer choices based on their shared moral framework. And that's how we operate as a society. Did I answer your question, Max?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, for me, it's very similar to what we talked about earlier, that there is the chain of compliance, but there's also the chain of ethics almost. The shared moral value that you might have with one vendor over the other, and that you have that choice, but at least that it is transparent. I think that's the main component of what you just said, that you want to create at least at minimum that transparency so people can make very informed choices. Ryan, for me, this has been very educational. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time. I have one last question for you that I wanted to ask you. And it's also the question that came up when on the previous episode of the podcast, and I think it's somebody on everybody's minds, really. And who doesn't love to try and predict the future of what's coming next, right? So for you, what are your predictions for future trends in ethics and privacy, or maybe even just AI compliance? Where do you see this going? And maybe there's two sides to that. What role do you see yourself playing, or do you hope to play in that particular topic? And what is, I would say, for you personally, the thing that you're most hopeful for that's going to happen in the future? So both for humanity and for yourself as well.
Yeah. And sorry about that.
Maybe it's one and the same.
Yeah, they are. And that's why I do what I do. And I apologize for that alarm. So ForHumanity aims to support the ecosystem of independent audit of AI systems. So that is our main goal. We do that in two ways. Number one, we aim to draft audit rules that are uniform for all persons to use, that are jurisdictionally sensitive all around the world. And at the same time, we aim to train people to know what compliance looks like. So they could be an auditor, they could be an advisor or a consultant, they could build technology solutions, or they can sit inside their own company and establish the compliance capacity. So those are the two things that we're going to do. And that belies my prediction for the future, which is, and I've predicted this since 2016, was definitely early, that eventually we will have mandatory annual audits for all high-risk AI systems. And that is something that's growing and coming. We don't have the capability of engaging in, it's estimated under the EU AI Act that 8 million AIs will have to be evaluated for a conformity assessment under the EU AI Act. We don't have the infrastructure to do that. We don't have people trained to do that. So it has to be something we have to grow into. I can't sit here and get mad at the world because we're not doing AI audits yet. Doesn't make any sense. ForHumanity has been training people through our education and training center now. We've less than 100 people as certified auditors. We've less than 200 people who've achieved just the foundations of independent audit of AI systems. We need hundreds of thousands of people, Max, who can do this before we have the infrastructure in place to do mandatory annual audits on all high-risk AIs, and to do that in a jurisdictionally sensitive way around the world. We're years away from being able to do that, but it doesn't mean we don't do the work that we do, and it doesn't mean we don't work towards that goal. Because in the end, we build an enormous infrastructure of trust if we have independent third-party evaluations of compliance with the laws, rules, standards, guidelines, best practices. And that is something we should aim for. It's something we do with drugs. It's something we do with cars and airplanes. The fact that we're not doing this with the things that are making human decisions for us it's literally crazy. But at the same time, we accept that we're on this journey. You used the word journey before. I totally agree with it. We're on this journey towards getting it right. And that's what ForHumanity is going to work towards.
Yeah, and I entirely shared that view. And it's my hope for the future. I'm not going to say prediction, because I think in terms of prediction, we're both on the same lines that it will happen. It's a matter of time. We are on this journey. My hope is that it actually happens soon enough, that a lot of people will get behind this initiative and realize that, hey, these technologies, although face value, they seem very, almost like a lot of times even inconspicuous. You don't know that they're there. They are making unconscious decisions. They're giving you guidance. They're giving you feedback. They're giving you answers to questions that you're asking them. And you're basing your responses to it, your decisions on those. So I do think it's of an incredible importance. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on to our podcast. I think it's been great having you on. And I hope you had a good time, actually.
I did have a good time. Thank you very much for having me on. And I hope you can tell this is something we care about a great deal. I could talk for hours on the subject. So happy to come back if that's useful. I enjoyed my time and I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, for sure. I think we should definitely, almost like a yearly audit, we should bring you back every year and see where we're at from the last time that we talked. So I think that's a splendid idea.
Sounds good.
So great to see you, and hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Max.